Hi, Young Living in Australia. Thank you for joining me. If you're with me live, if you're watching the replay, thank you as well. My name is Sharon Wild, and I often say to myself, what would Gary do? So at the start of a presentation like this is one of those things that Gary would be doing. He would be grabbing some Young Living oils, and the 3 oils that he would be grabbing before he speaks can any of you guess? Maybe pop in the comments what you think some of those oils may be as I grab them myself. Someone's probably going to guess the first one, which is Valor. So Valor is something that Gary would apply along his spine, under his feet. He would also use energy oil, and he would apply that along his spine. And he would then use an oil to help him with delivering the information he was about to present. And one of the oils that he would often use is called Brain Power. You can also use Clarity. So I have both of those with me today. So if you have any of those oils handy, you might want to enjoy using those, smelling them, putting them on your body, however you would like to use them, as long as you use them. There's a saying that I often have, that the oils only work if we open the lids and use them. So make sure that you grab some of your oils. Now, as we're waiting for a few more people to join us live, 2 of the oils that I'll briefly be mentioning today, which you may have and you might want to grab. So one of those is humility here, and the other is gratitude. So I've named this story that I'll be sharing with you today a story of gratitude. So if you have those oils handy, go and grab them. If you don't, go and grab any oil that you have, any Young Living, preferably a blend, because in every blend there's a little bit of Gary inside those bottles. So let's jump in. Again, thank you for joining me. My name is Sharon Wild. I am a passionate essential oiler. You will see some of that passion coming through today. Now, some of you I have met. I've had the pleasure of meeting you. Some of you I haven't. Though the purpose of today isn't about me. It's not about Sharon Wild. This is about passing forward a legacy. And you'll see as I share some of this legacy that some of the things that I learnt from Gary will actually come through in this presentation. And I don't know at which stages they'll come through, because some of it's already coming through as I speak with you now, but we'll just ride through this joyful, blissful, emotional roller coaster together as I share with you a tribute to Gary. And the reason why I do this is I'm not special, but some of you may not have had the opportunity of seeing Gary, whether you didn't get to see him on stage or whether you didn't get to spend some in-person time with him. I am extremely grateful that I did have that opportunity, and that's the reason why I'm here. And I have shared this story with many people before, but there are many more people who need to hear this information because they didn't have that opportunity of spending time with Gary. So I see it as part of my personal journey and personal what I'm here for is to help to pass some of those stories forward so that you can then feel like you've had that opportunity of spending time with Gary. You can see it's something that's very dear to my heart. So we'll see how we go today in me holding myself together during this presentation. And again, you'll see some of the life lessons coming through, and they're coming through right now already. Okay. So grab your oils and have them handy because you might need them too along the way. So let's get started. I invite you to close your eyes for just a moment. So close your eyes. Imagine that it's a warm, sunny morning and the phone rings. You pick up the phone, and on the other end of the phone, it's Young Living Corporate. And they've phoned to let you know that Gary Young has decided to hold the first ever balsam fir planting. He'd like some Australians to be there, and you've been selected as one of those people. So just for a moment, imagine how you would be feeling if you received that phone call. So how would you be feeling? This is how I was feeling when I received that phone call. I was so excited. I was jumping out of my skin. I had so much respect for Gary, and I couldn't believe that I was going to have this opportunity of spending time not only at a Young Living farm, but also with Gary. So would it be okay if I share some of those experiences with you today? Okay, so I received that phone call, got very excited, jumped on a plane, and headed over to the United States. Now, there's 2 farms that I visited on that particular farm trip. I've been fortunate to have visited several other farms around the world, but I'm going to be featuring 2 of these farms from this particular experience. Now, this was the balsam fir planting. So it's the first of their reforestation projects that they had in 2011. So I'm on the plane, really excited. We arrive at the airport, and Gary Young was there to greet us when we arrived. Now, when I say us, it wasn't just myself and my lovely husband, Andrew. There was a small group of Young Living members there. And so I jump in the car, and I jumped into what Gary calls a truck. In the US they call them truck, we call them utes here. So we jump into Gary's truck or his ute. Gary is in the driver's seat. There's another person in the front seat, and I'm sitting in, they have a little, I don't know if they call them bucket seats, I'll have to find out what the terminology is, but a little seat that they have in US cars between the driver and the front passenger. I'm sitting in the middle seat there, right next to Gary, like elbows touching next to Gary, as we drive from the airport across to the Young Living farm. So over that about 1.5 hour drive, Gary started sharing stories with us about the early years of his own journey and also the early years of Young Living. So put yourself in that bucket seat with me as I share some of the things that Gary shared with us. Now, we don't have the time availability to share all of those things with you, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse. So we're driving along, and Gary starts telling us about the early days in Young Living. And he says, actually, let's have a little side trip, because this is the first area. We're not far from the first area in Spokane where I planted my first seeds for Young Living, my first seedlings. So he turned the car around, did a detour. So again, this is like Gary Young, the founder of a now billion-dollar company, giving us a personal tour of Young Living history. So we drive, and he shows us the first plot that he had there in Spokane, where he had his first seedlings. And if you have a look at the Gary Young book, and I'll feature that later so you can see what that looks like, you'll see pictures of that very lot. We continued to drive along, and Gary shared with us the story of how he came to find the St. Mary's farm. So that's the farm that we were driving to on that particular day. So I'm going to share just a little tiny glimpse into that particular story. You see, Gary had been looking for pristine land. He'd been looking for about 3 to 4 years for a property where he wanted to be able to grow plants for Young Living. And then one day he was in the St. Mary's area, and he was driving along, and he described it as if the car basically started driving itself. And he said he came to a fork in the road, and the car went to the right, it went to the next right, then it did a full circle, so this is the car being guided as to where to go, and then it drove up over a hill to what is now the St. Mary's farm. Now, if any of you have had the pleasure of visiting that farm, I've had that opportunity several times myself. It is an amazing farm. They're all fantastic farms. I encourage you to visit as many of the Young Living farms as you can, though this particular farm is one of my personal favorites, and it's because the energy there is exceptional. Some people describe it as it's like this amazing energy vortex that's there to just... I could talk all day just about that farm. Anyway, that's how Gary came to find that particular farm. He wanted clean, pristine land, and it just happened to have amazing energy there as well. The first night I stayed on that farm that night, I couldn't sleep that night because the energy was buzzing so much. I was just so alive. It was fantastic. So get yourself there if you have the opportunity. Okay. So we continued along this drive with Gary, sharing stories, and Gary shared that at the time when he found that particular property at St. Mary's, he basically didn't really have any funds to be able to buy it, and he had to scrape together about $2,000 for the deposit. And he talked about some of his financial struggles that he had been having and some of his personal relationship struggles. And I share that with you because this is someone who we had literally just met. And he was sharing that there was a small 5 or so young living members in the car with him. And he was sharing from his heart. He doesn't hold back as to who he is, where he's come from. He is completely authentic and genuine. And I say is because I believe he's still with us. So he was just openly, as if he was talking to someone that he'd known his whole life. He was sharing himself with people that he'd only just met. And that was the type of person that he was. So I'll continue along our journey. So some of you may not be aware where this particular farm is located. So there's 2 farms that I'll be referring to, the Balsam Fir Farm and the St. Mary's Farm. And they're both in the northern part of the United States. So you can see on the screen there a map of the 2 farms that we'll be talking about. So the Balsam Fir Farm, I'll show you some pictures of that one. It's right up near the Canadian border. And the St. Mary's Farm is a couple of hours drive south of that one. Okay, so let's talk about the St. Mary's Farm first. Now, 3 of these pictures that you can see here are pictures that I took on that very first trip. It was in April, which at that time of year in the US is springtime, but you'll see obviously there it was snowing, so it was really cold, even though technically it was in spring. And then the other photo that you can see with a RV, or like a big caravan, we might call it here in Australia, and a big truck is actually the truck and the RV that Andrew, my husband, and I own, and that was on another visit at that particular farm. So you can see some of the log cabins that they have there in the background that you can stay in when you actually visit that farm. During that farm visit, we had the opportunity of planting melissa seeds. So you can see pictures of Andrew and myself there. In the background, you can see what the melissa actually looks like once it starts growing. And we also had the opportunity of, what the purpose of that particular trip was, is to plant balsam fir plants. So this was on the Highland Flats farm. So this is the farm that's right up there on the Canadian border. So you can see there pictures of Andrew and I. I'll show you a few pictures, but then I'm going to show you just a little snippet of video footage. So, and I'll explain through that footage some of what we learnt along the way. So here you can see pictures of Gary showing us how to plant the plants. There's this very specific way that the plants needed to be planted to ensure that they would survive and prosper. So he showed us exactly how to do that. You can see him demonstrating that there. And Gary would actually be out in the field with us. So he wasn't someone who just said, you go and do this is how you do it, and he'd sit back and put his feet up. I don't think Gary ever put his feet up at any stage during his life. He was always out there in the field because he loved being in the field. He really described himself as a farmer or a cowboy. He loved being out in the mountains and at the Young Living farms. It didn't matter what time of year, what the weather was like, plants still needed to be planted. So you can see, obviously, my name and Gary's name there. You can see us out in the field there, along with other Young Living members planting plants. And you'll see that in the upcoming video footage as well. And we had the opportunity of driving tractors. And I might mention a little bit about that during the video as well. So let me bring up that video for you and share some of those experiences. Okay, hopefully you can see that video coming through. If I can get a nod from a few people to let me know that that's all good, that the video is coming through. Yes, it is. Awesome. It's great when technology is doing what it's supposed to be doing. Okay, so you can see there Gary showing Andrew how to dig the holes for the balsam fir plants. That's me using the tamper to tamp the plants down. you can see that in this particular example, Gary then took over from Andrew and continued to dig the holes. So Gary was out there in the field with us. He just loved being out in the field, as I said. You can see a little bit of the snow on the ground there as it had been snowing. It was really freezing cold. We had snow come through at different times, but we were absolutely loving every single moment of this experience. It's just something that I get goosebumps just thinking about it right now. I feel like I'm right there now, and hopefully you're feeling some of that too as I share this with you. You can see the snow coming down there, but we're still out in the field and absolutely loving this experience. Okay, so shortly you'll see the tractors coming up. So in the first little bit of footage, you'll see in the tractor that I look quite pale, like I'm scared of driving the tractor. It was just really, really cold at night time. And here you can see in the video, we actually got to name each row. So we could select a row of the seedlings that have been planted, and we got to name it in our honour. So I got to plant a row, had a row named in my honour, and Andrew had one as well, and you can just see that on the video that went through there. The driving the tractor is not something that Young Living will be hiring me to do anytime soon, but Gary wanted people to have the experience and the opportunity of knowing what it was like to do some of these different activities that are involved in the seed to seal process. So he allowed Andrew and myself and some of the other members. You can see Dallas Harding there, who's Marcella von Harding's son. He's a diamond in Young Living, was on the other tractor there in the background. And it was something that Gary had great patience in allowing each of us to do, because I am definitely not the most efficient tractor driver. As I said, Young Living will not be hiring me. I'm the slowest tractor driver ever. And some of the people, I won't mention any names, that actually had some of the tractor trackpad things flip off a few times when they were trying to use the tractors to dig up tree stumps and stuff like that. And Gary showed tremendous patience in having to put those tractor wheel things, tractor pads, whatever they're called, I don't know the lingo, back onto the tractors. But again, he wanted each of us to be able to have that experience, and we were really grateful that we were able to do that. Okay, so that's a little bit of a footage and a little bit of a glimpse into some of that experience. Now, when let me just check on my slides here, because there is one that I was going to explain to you, and I think I might have skipped it earlier. So let me just double check on that. Okay, we will keep going. So, Gary loved to teach. It was just, there were so many things that he loved doing. He loved being on the farms. He loved, there's a few other things that I'll mention about the chemistry and those sorts of things of oils shortly. But he really, you could see he would literally light up when he was out in the field with a small group of members, when he was able to share information about what it is that they do at the farms and how it is that these farms came to be, and talking about the distillation process. And he would just be absolutely alive in energy, and you'd just see the passion pouring through him. It was just amazing. So Gary shared with us many stories during the course of this week that we stayed with him on these two farms. And I'll share a few little video insights from that experience for you so that you can actually hear it from Gary. Though we don't have the opportunity to share all of those with you in this time opportunity. So I'll show you the videos in a moment, but a few of the other things beyond what you'll see in the videos is Gary shared why it was that we don't have organic certification, or why he chose not to pursue that particular path. He told us about the great lengths that Young Living go to for researching into the distillation process, into testing, like the extreme lengths that no other company does. And he didn't just say, we give us a checklist of we do this test is, he didn't just give us a checklist. He went into great detail as to each of the steps that Young Living take, like extreme detail as to what they do. And you can just see how much love and energy and effort and learning and knowledge he had acquired that he put into what he now offers us in each of these amazing bottles of oils. He also shared with us how it was that often he would encounter a particular challenge that he was facing, and that whatever that challenge was, he would often put it out there, and he would often receive guidance. And often he would talk about, he shared many stories with us about how he would receive this guidance and inspiration in the middle of the night, and he'd have a really precise time. So there are so many stories that he shared with us about, at this particular time in the middle of the night. And one of those stories he shared with us is that, at 2:10 a.m. I woke up and I had very clear guidance as to what I needed to do to solve this particular challenge that he was having at that time. So if you've heard from people, you might hear many of those types of stories. So now I'm going to share with you 2 videos so you can hear from Gary yourself. Now this footage is footage that my husband and Andrew and I personally took. Gary was aware that he was being filmed, so he knew that this could be shared with people, and we're looking to pass some of this insight forward to you. So the first one that I'll share with you is Gary had a great learning journey. He's now considered to be one of the master distillers in the world. He's very well known, has an amazing reputation. But he had to learn to get to that point. So I'm going to share with you a short video of Gary talking about who he learnt from. And so I'll share that with you now.
1992, I'd spent 5 years going to France, an average of 3 times a year, working in the lavender fields and just volunteering and working in the distilleries to learn. And I kept hearing this man's name being mentioned, Henry Vieux, as being the greatest distillator in our time. And I wanted to meet him. I wanted to study with him. I wanted to learn from him because he had such a reputation. And so I spent 5 years trying to get to meet him and talking to people around that knew him, and And finally, after 5 years, Jean Noel arranged to see him, meet him, talk to him, invite him to his house for dinner when I was there working. And he sat on my left side at the dinner table, and 2 hours of dinner, he never spoke a word of English. And he and Jean Noel talked, and Jean Noel's wife was from California, and so her and I conversed through dinner. And if you've never eaten in France, you would understand that the Pamela's been there, that a dinner is a 3-hour ordeal. 2 hours for the dinner, a half hour for dessert, and then a half hour for wine and cheese. And
2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of Gary talking.
Anyway, and so after the meal was completely over and finished, he turned to me for the first time. And he sort of put his hand on my forearm, and he looked me right square in the eye, and he says, "Mr. Young, what are essential oils mean to you?" And it really took me back, because I didn't expect the English. And then his question took all of a second. And I just went into my heart, and I just looked at him and I said, "Mr. Vieux, essential oils are the closest tangible substance on the face of the earth to God that exists." And he squoze my arm, the tears run off his cheek, and he picked up his other finger and he goes like this: "You are absolutely right. And anyone who adulterates them, anyone who messes with them, should be treated as a criminal."
And we went to his house and found him.
So you did get to learn something from him.
I was the only person he taught distillation to in his life. And then I spent 6 years learning from Mr. Espew, who was the president of the Lavender Growers Association. I go over there 3 times a year and distilled lavender with him, distilled cypress with him. And I was his only student before he died. Even his own sons didn't carry on after him. And Marta, his wife, is still alive, and every time I go over, I go visit her, and I'm her son.
So that is our first glimpse into Gary. Next, I'll show a video of Gary talking about part of the distillation process. Now, there's no tests after this, after you watch this video. So the purpose isn't for you to retain all of the exact scientific info that he presents, but it's more along the lines of allowing you to see the lengths that young living go to in constantly looking to improve their distillation process, and how it's not only about the science, there's also an art that comes into distillation.
The oil will go into the steam, it condenses inside the cooker and drops right into the bottom, and it's called reflux. And you lose the whole thing. And this is what people don't understand about distillation and what it takes. And so we have to run our temperatures here at 280 degrees. We start the steam into the cooker at 280, and then we have to flood it. Meaning we push the steam as fast as we can to get it through the chips to the breaking point. And when it breaks, then we've got to throttle it back instantly to keep it from flooding the condenser and losing the oil. But if we don't push the steam till it gets through there, the oil will drop right back out, homogenized in the water. And then if we don't pull it back, right when the steam breaks and it goes into the condenser, we overload the condenser and it won't cool fast enough, and then it burns the oil. And distilling is such an art. And knowing how to listen. And I've taught all my operators, and Brett's on his second year now of training, to listen to the sound. It's like tuning a piano. You've got to listen to the notes of the steam as it travels through that cooker, and you've got to know the sound it's making when it's 2 feet up, when it's 3 feet up, when it's 4 feet up, when it's 6 feet up, when it's 8 feet, and know what it sounds like when it breaks. Because if you don't recognize that sound when it breaks, you'll lose all the oil right there in that condenser. It's that critical.
Gary shared with us a story about his, again, wanting to constantly improve the distillation process. And one day he wanted to know how the distillers actually worked. Now, much to Mary later finding out what he actually did, one day Gary actually jumped inside one of the distillers and had one of the employees close the lid and turn it on, because he wanted to know how the steam actually would move through the plant material and how it actually worked. So he put himself inside the distiller. Mary came along and found out and was not very impressed with that particular scenario. But it's just, again, he was always looking to find out ways to better distill our amazing oils, or our plants to get our amazing oils. So next I'm going to take a little side trip, if I can get my mouse back. There we go. Okay, so I've been talking about the balsam fir planting experience. As I mentioned, I've had many other opportunities of visiting Young Living farms, and some of those whilst Gary was there. So I'm going to take a slight little side tangent and talk about the first ever distillation of Royal Hawaiian Sandalwood. And the reason why I share this is, again, it demonstrates the lengths that Gary and Young Living go to. Now, each plant is distilled precisely for what that particular plant needs. So it's not that every plant is distilled for the same, at the same pressure, the same heat, for the same period of time. And Gary was always looking to test the plants and testing the process. Ange and I had the fortunate experience of just happening to be there at that very first distillation of the Royal Hawaiian Sandalwood at the St. Mary's farm. So they just had a big shipment of the chips that had just arrived, and we were there whilst they were being cooked and distilled for the very first time. And you can see some pictures there of Gary examining that, and you can see a picture of Andrew and myself there with that first distillation. Now, what we witnessed firsthand is what we'd heard about. We'd heard that Gary would always test and look to improve. We were literally standing next to Gary as he was looking and examining this first distillation, and Gary would say, okay, the steam hasn't come through this part of the plant material, it hasn't done this, it hasn't done that. We need to modify our distillation process for this particular plant because it distills differently to the other sandalwood that Young Living had previously distilled. And we were literally standing next to Gary, like a meter next to Gary, as he was on the phone with his boilermaker saying, you need to get over here now because we need to make this adjustment to this tube, and we need to do this, we need to do that, and we need to do it now because everything needed to be done now because Gary wanted everything for us as soon as possible. So we were able to witness that firsthand, and it was absolutely amazing. That was actually for a lavender harvest that we were there for. That was the purpose of that visit, and we just had that bonus that we got to experience on that particular occasion. Okay, now I'm going to jump back out of that side tangent and take you to the Highland Flats farm in Idaho. So at the time, this is what that farm looked like, where we actually stayed there. So we called it the Taj Mahal. It was a big tent set up, a bit like the army tents you see, the old MASH episodes, that sort of a thing. And now they actually have a big roof that covers over the top of this. But at the time in 2011, that's what it looked like. When we arrived, we had to trudge through knee-deep mud in bead Ugg boots, and as you saw with some of the video footage earlier, it was snowing and cold and wet, but we absolutely loved it. Now, when we very first arrived at this farm, Gary had arrived there a little bit before we did. So whilst we were planting some of those Melissa seeds, Gary, that I showed earlier, Gary drove up to this farm to get it prepared because these tents were new at that stage. It was new accommodation on the farm for us to stay in for that experience. And when we arrived, this is what we were presented with. Gary up on the roof in his socks, fixing the chimney on because he wanted to make sure that we would be warm because it was really cold there. So the reason why I show this to you is that the person who Gary was, he is an amazing authority, has so much wisdom and knowledge, and was amazing on stage at convention. But behind the scenes, he was the guy who was up on the roof fixing the chimney so that we, the members who are coming for this experience, would be warm. He is the person who would be making us breakfast in the morning. And this is where we first came to learn about einkorn. This is years before einkorn became part of the Young Living range. Gary actually prepared and served us these einkorn pancakes and told us all of the stories about einkorn, many of which he's since were reflected in his book about einkorn that is available. He also was extremely humble, and that's why on the previous slide I had a picture of humility oil, and that's the reason why I mentioned that oil earlier. Now, humility, if it's an oil that you have, I encourage you to grab it as I'm sharing with you. If it's not, I encourage you to acquire it so that you do have it. Gary was an extremely humble person. So here we are at this farm experience. There's about 10 or so Young Living members, and we arrive at this Taj Mahal tent, and at the back of the tent there was a little private room. So you can see a picture of that room. You can see the green and purple towel there. That's the little room I'm talking about. So not an extravagant, we are out on a farm. It is a tent after all. But this was Gary's private room that was set aside for him. And when Gary heard that there was a couple who had come from Australia, he decided to give up his room for Andrew and myself so that we could stay in there. And he stayed in the bunks with the rest of the guys. At the other farm that we visited, the St. Mary's farm, he did something similar in that there weren't actually enough beds for the members to stay. So Gary gave up he has a little personal house at that farm. He gave up his personal house, allowed the members to stay in his bed there, and he went and stayed in the big shed, the garage, and slept on the floor. So what does that say about the leader of a now $1.5 billion, $2 billion, wherever we're at now, dollar company? That he would give up whatever he had for other people to make sure that they were okay. He was the last person to sleep at night. So you can see a picture there of an old chimney or a fireplace there. He would be stoking the fire late at night to make sure that we were all warm, because it was freezing cold and we were in tents. So that was the type of person that he was. There are many other stories that you will come to find out about Gary, and if you don't already have this book, I highly encourage you to get your hands on it. It's called Gary Young. It's the Seed to Seal book, and it's available from LSP, so discoverlsp.com.au. You can get your hands on this book. It talks about the full seed to seal process, about Gary's life journey, has amazing pictures and stories in there. I highly encourage you to get your hands on one of these books, and in that you'll hear a lot more about Gary's story. Now, if you'd like to hear Gary's story through Gary himself, if you take a note of what you can see on the screen at the moment, there's a video on YouTube, and you can see the subject, the title of that. It's called D. Gary Young Beauty Stool 1217. So that's when it was recorded, and you can go there. It's about a 2-hour video, and that's Gary sharing a lot of his stories based upon that particular book. So if you haven't watched that already, I encourage you to go and watch that so you can hear Gary sharing his stories through his own voice. Now, what many people haven't had the opportunity of experiencing is Gary beyond the stage and beyond the many books that he authored and beyond all of the CDs and all of the other things that are available where Gary has shared. And that's part of what I'll be sharing with you now. Now, I'm not sharing this because I'm special. I'm certainly not the only person who has had this experience. I don't claim in any way to be Gary's BFF or anything like that. I'm simply someone who had this opportunity of sharing, being part of a very small group of people when Gary was sharing information with us. So I'm looking to pass some of that experience forward for you. So here you can see a picture of us inside that Taj Mahal tent, and this is literally a front row seat to Gary teaching. So during the day we would be out in the field planting the plants, and then in the evening, because it was dark and we couldn't plant anymore, Gary would be teaching, and we would do that right through the night. So hours and hours and hours of Gary teaching. Now, some of these presentations that he offered, he also offered at conventions and through other learning opportunities, but some of the things that he shared weren't things that he shared to a larger audience. Now you can see me there. I had blonde hair at the time. Literally a front row seat, so right across the table from Gary sharing, and he'd get the whiteboard up there and he'd be drawing things, and that was the type of environment in which we were able to learn from Gary. Now, he shared with us many of the stories of his time in Ecuador and his time going out into the jungles and the discoveries that he made and how he talked to the shamans and all of those amazing experiences. You'll see the pictures that I have here are pictures from Gary's book, so you'll see much of the, that information is available in Gary's book. I encourage you to have a look through that. Some amazing stories in there. Gary loved the chemistry of essential oils. Anyone who was with Young Living in the younger years, every time that Gary had the opportunity to, when he was on stage, he would be teaching about the chemistry of essential oils. It was very close to his heart. And some of the information that he shared with us on this particular trip, he later shared at other conventions that we attended, but some of the things that he shared there were new insights at the time. So discoveries that he had just made that hadn't been announced yet. So you can imagine how amazing that was to have that experience of hearing some of the things they were working on before they actually progressed through and became part of the Young Living range. And that timing was when Gary was still, he'd just come from the Ecuador farm, so he had been living there for about 5 or 6 years or so, and this trip, literally he was coming back from that farm and sharing some of the new discoveries and some of the new plants and oils that they were working with. So absolutely mind-expanding information. He also shared with us some of his journeys. So you can see a picture, some of the pictures from his Middle East experiences along the frankincense trail. And he actually had a frankincense, the One Gift documentary and the One Gift book. And he told many of the stories about how that book came to be and the insights that he had along the way and some of the discoveries that he made. So I encourage you to get your hands on that book. It's also available from discoverlsp.com.au, and just many, many stories beyond what I have the time opportunity to share with you today. Now, Gary was a very gifted healer. So when I say healer, I mean hands-on type healing, gifted as well as his scientific knowledge and ability to put together formulas for amazing oils and supplements and other oil-infused products. Here you can see a picture of Gary performing a raindrop technique. Now, there are literally thousands, probably tens of thousands of people around the world who had the opportunity of attending raindrop technique training sessions with Gary, and then many of those people have gone on to teach people as well. So many people have had the benefit of experiencing a raindrop technique, and that's a technique that he actually developed himself. Though one of the things that I observed about Gary is I remember one particular convention that I attended in the United States, and they would have all of their main sessions where people would go along and schedule what they were going to see. But then occasionally Gary would make a surprise unannounced appearance in the product expo area. So there was a product expo, and then all of a sudden on the loudspeaker to say, oh, Gary's over on the stage in the middle of the product expo. He's about to do a live demonstration of something. And on this particular occasion, it was the raindrop technique. And I remember Gary having a lady, just chose a lady out of the audience there, and she popped up on the table, and Gary had this amazing way of tuning in to whatever was happening for that particular person. And he would connect very deeply with that person, and he would be able to tell people things about themselves. And people would go, how did you know that about me? But he just had, and I've heard many people share similar stories, that he would just be able to know or intuit things about people or about what it was that was going to help their journey, their health and wellness journey. So it was amazing to actually witness some of that. We had the opportunity of seeing that in person as well during this farm experience that I've been sharing with you, in that Gary would actually, some of the pictures, footage I've shown you so far was actually taken in the lounge room in Gary's home, home away from home at the St. Mary's farm. And he would actually get down, kneel on the floor, so down on his knees, and have a person laying on the floor, and he would perform a technique on them. So whether it was neuroauricular technique or just a type of application of the oils onto the shoulders and the neck area, whatever it was at the time, he did it several times, and he would be down there as the humble healer in just passing that love and that healing energy forward in combination with our amazing oils and the techniques that he developed. Now, next I'm going to share with you an insight that some of you may not be aware of. Part of Gary's early years, he came from a very humble place and grew into an amazing person. Full of wisdom, full of knowledge, full of insight, a world inspirer. But he didn't start there. So I'm going to share with you a video. Now, you may or may not need some tissues handy. It is very touching to hear some of the background. Now, the framework for this particular story is Gary was talking about the Ecuador stool. So the Young Living Academy in Ecuador, some of you have had the opportunity of visiting that stool, as has Andrew and I have had that opportunity. And this is a little bit of an insight as to why Gary looked to have a stool and what his purpose and aim was for that stool. So I'm going to play that video for you.
School for me was very difficult. I hated it. I didn't want to go to school because my dad always said education ruined a good man, and I didn't want to be ruined. So I didn't want to go to school, and the only reason I got through school was because of sports. We were a small school, 28 in my graduating class, and And I was on the varsity wrestling team and the varsity track team and the high school rodeo team. I was the #1 champion and saddle bronc rider. And my principal of our school was my wrestling coach. I had to have a C average in order to be on the wrestling team. So he, talked to all my teachers and saw that I got a C on my report card so I could be in sports. But when I left high school, I couldn't write. I didn't speak English well, hardly at all. It was called mountain dialect that Mary has coached me.
Refined you.
And now Mary is learning mountain dialect.
He didn't need to speak English, he could speak horse. And that's
And I couldn't read. I couldn't pronounce words because we didn't have phonics in school, and I wasn't taught how to read. I could read comic books, and not till I was in the hospital in '73, and the night shift nurse, the graveyard shift nurse, came in, and she had noticed that my roommate, who had MS, he was always trying to get me to read the Bible with him, and I'd say, "Well, Bill, you go ahead and read, and then I'll take my turn." And when my turn would come, I'd go to sleep. And she'd seen this several times, and she came in one morning at 2 o'clock doing rounds, and she says, "Gary, you don't know how to read, do you?" And I said, "Of course I do." She said, "Well, how come you never read when Bill gives you the Bible and it's your turn to read?" And I said, "Oh, I don't feel like it." She said, "I know why you don't feel like it." So she started teaching me phonics. Anyway, it's just one of those things that when you go through life like that and then you stand on stage and you lecture and people hand you notes about how bad your English is afterwards, it's kind of embarrassing. And I always thought, if I could ever build a school, it would be different. Yeah. And because every school has kids like me that have difficulty learning. But they don't do anything about it. They don't care to help. This little girl was 13 years old and was in the 3rd grade. And she couldn't read or write. She couldn't do arithmetic. So I sat down with the principal and I said, this is not going to be your ordinary school. We're going to develop programs to help kids learn. So I took all the children that were having difficulty with arithmetic and we took them outside on field projects. And here they were planting tomatoes. And they had to measure the compost that they put in each tomato plant. They had to weigh it. And they had to write it down. They had to count the tomatoes that they put in. They had to line the row, and they had to measure the plants and create the spacing between the plants. It was part of their arithmetic class.
Practical math.
Practical math. And then we took the children here. See this little gal? We divide them up, 5 kids in a group, and she was the group leader. And they would pick their flowers and count them, and she would write down the number of flowers they picked. And then they would have to weigh the flowers, count them, and then weigh them to see how many flowers it took to make a kilo of wet flower weight. And then we would rest the flowers for 24 hours, then they would weigh them again and recount to see how many flowers in dry flower weight. And then how many flowers they picked per hectare. And then they distilled them. And then they would calculate the liquid weight against the dry weight to see how much oil was produced in a given plot of land that was theirs. And,
Cool. That's the way to do it.
and all these students who couldn't do arithmetic now are A students 2 years later. And we do projects. Now we're building the goat dairy, and the children are learning how to milk the goats. They're learning to feed them. We're putting in a big chicken farm for eggs for the school, because these kids all eat organic food now.
But it's revolutionized the whole community because the parents, are saying for the first time the children want to learn. For the first time they come home and all they can talk about is school and what they're learning and their field trips. And we've taken them different places, around, not far out. We go to Guayaquil and different places, to the zoo, and just exposing them to the world. And this year now, last year we started the baseball team in the sports program. And then last fall we had an Olympics at the school and competed with some of the other schools. And they're just being exposed to
So much more.
a whole different world, and
That's so awesome.
we've got all the computer sciences, the language. We have an full-time English program, arts program, sports program, everything. And the parents, and this is what I was really hoping for, that the parents would see it and want to see more. And so the parents came and says, our kids are not sick. They're not missing school. They're happier at home. Dr. Young, why? What are you doing? And I said, it's about the diet. So now Dr. Leda and I take turns when I'm there teaching nutrition classes, and Rosa teaching cooking classes for the parents. And now it's just spreading through the whole community, wanting to.
That's where it starts.
So I don't know about you, but is your heart just expanded just listening to that underlying purpose of what Gary was about? And that's just part of the love that he offered and that movement that he started with. All of us were now part of that movement. Now, one of the things that I'm extremely grateful for is it's one thing to be able to see Gary on stage and learn from him, and he's written many books and there's many other ways that we can continue to learn from him. Though we had the opportunity in this particular trip, and it's unlike any other experience that generally was available, because most of the farm experiences where Gary was in attendance, during the day we'd be doing things in the farm, in the field, and then at night time Gary would be distilling. But because this was a planting experience, there was no distillation that was actually happening. So it meant that we not only had the opportunity of Gary teaching each evening, but then after the teaching had concluded, Gary was then basically available, and like I said, he was the last person to go to bed at night. So there were many late nights, so several nights where we were going to bed at like 3 a.m. in the morning because we were continuing to learn and absorb every little piece of nugget of knowledge that we could from Gary. So you can see a picture there of a few of us in the kitchen in the Taj Mahal there, and can you just imagine if you could ask Gary a question, whatever that question would be. We had the opportunity of doing that. You can see I have a little notebook there because Gary loved it when people would bring a notebook. If people asked him questions, he wanted to make sure that they were taking notes of what information he was sharing. And along through the teaching that he offered there, it's one of the reasons why Andrew and I talked so much about Young Living supplements, particularly sulfazyme. After that trip, sulfazyme became our favourite supplement, and it's because of the information that we learned from Gary on that particular trip. Now, a lot of that information is available in books that are available at Life Science Publishing and also on Amazon, so it's not just restricted to the people who happen to be there, but we got a true insight as to how amazing the Young Living supplements are, particularly sulfazyme, and some of the other supplements they have in the US like enzymes, so we absolutely love those as well. And that picture there that you can see is basically what was happening, a visual representation of what was happening to my mind during that experience. It was mind opening, the types of things that Gary was sharing with us. And some of the things that he shared were insights as to what the company was looking to do as well with some of their supplements. So just absolutely amazing information. Now, raise your hand if you've ever heard of leaky eye syndrome. No, it's not a medical condition, so we don't need to think about compliance here. This is what Gary would often refer to as, sometimes he'd call it his allergies, again, not a medical condition. It's when Gary would allow himself, when he was speaking to people, to bear his emotions. So if something came through, if he was feeling particularly connected with whatever it was that he was sharing in that moment, he would often pause and then allow the emotion to flow through him and be seen. And that was one of the life lessons that I learned from him, which is being demonstrated right now. It's okay to allow whatever it is that you're feeling to come through. It helps us to be truly authentic with people if we allow whatever it is, and no judgment on whatever it is. It's not good or bad. It's not suggesting that we're vulnerable or not. It's simply allowing whatever is coming through to come through. And he taught me that. Because before that, I wasn't comfortable in showing that, in doing this, what I'm doing with you right now. And I'm not planning this, like I said earlier, it may or may not come through, but Gary allowed that to be and made that okay. And some of you may have seen that often when he was on stage at convention and he talked about his love for his wife and his children, and you would see it and you would feel it because he wouldn't hold it back. And he showed that and made that okay. So that's one of the lessons that I learned from him. And at the end of this particular trip, I had a profound outpouring of leaky eye syndrome. And some of you have heard me share these stories before, but I haven't shared this component because I don't always know if I can hold myself during it. I'll see how I go. So at the end of this particular farm experience, Gary, it was the last evening, and Gary said, well, I can teach you raindrop tonight. I can show you how to do that, or we can, what do you guys want to do? And Gary then paused and he said, I want to hear from each of you about what you'd like to share about your experiences this week. So each person took turns. They would stand and share some of their whatever they wanted to share. And at the time I was a little bit annoyed by that. I said, I want to hear from Gary. I want to get every possible opportunity of hearing anything that Gary has to bestow upon us, rather than hearing about everyone else. But what actually unfolded was also a demonstration of the type of person that he was, because he wanted people to connect and grow within themselves. And some of the things that people experienced during that week, we talk about network marketing as a personal growth journey, and boy, there was a lot of personal growth on that particular trip for all of the people involved. And that particular night, I had loved Young Living. I was a passionate oiler. But that night, standing in front of Gary as witness and the other members there, I didn't put it in these words, but reflecting back on it now, I declared how I'd been selfish. And saying that is going to hit a chord for some of you because it sounds really blunt and harsh. But this is what I mean, because I can reflect back on it now. I love Young Living and our oils and our supplements and all of the things that come with Young Living. But I was being selfish because I had shared with people. I was an executive at the time. It wasn't that I wasn't doing anything to let people know, but I wasn't doing enough. I was allowing my own limitations to stop me from sharing with more people, because we are part of a global movement which was started by Gary, but Gary couldn't do it all by himself. He now has a whole tribal world community that's helping to pass his legacy forward. But each of us need to be part of that. So at that time, I had shared with a certain number of people, but I wasn't helping to empower those people to share with more people, to be part of this global movement. And that's what I shared with Gary on that particular night, because he helped me to see that. He wasn't trying to get there, but that's part of my personal growth journey, one of the things that I learned. And now that Gary has passed, he has left us with this legacy of not only passing his stories forward like I'm doing with you today, but also in helping people. Because we all want to help people. But if we're being selfish by keeping this information to ourselves, by not letting people know how their health and wellness and their abundance can be improved through Young Living, we're being selfish. So I encourage you, that word is not a word that is comfortable, but I encourage you to look at ways that you can look to step outside of whatever it is that might be holding you back from sharing with more people. Or perhaps it's to help empower your team members to share with more people. So that's one of the lessons that I've learned that he's helped me with. And I encourage you to pass that forward to your team members as well, because there's someone, I wasn't sure whether I would share that particular story today or not, but there's someone who's watching this, or someone watching this knows that needs to hear that. There's something that's holding them back. So that brings us to gratitude oil, the oil that I named this particular story after. I'm sure that most of you are extremely grateful for having someone introducing them to Young Living. I've been part of this amazing community. We're in Australia here, but we have people all around the world who are part of this global movement that Gary started. So I encourage you, if you have gratitude oil, to grab it, to apply some to your hands, to breathe it in, to rub it wherever you would like to rub it, to immerse yourself in gratitude oil, and take a moment. If you'd like to close your eyes whilst you're doing this, you're certainly welcome to. If you'd like to keep your eyes open, that's okay too. If you have a picture of Gary, you can see a couple of pictures on the screen at the moment, or if you have a book or anything that has a picture of Gary, you might want to grab that. Or just imagine yourself looking at a picture of Gary. So as you're breathing in that gratitude oil, gaze into Gary's eyes. Continue to look deep into his eyes. Connect with him, because he's still here with us. And I encourage you, whenever you need to do this process, to connect with Gary, because he's always there with us, and to thank him. Because he's done so much for all of us and continues to facilitate that. So I encourage you, as you're gazing into Gary's eyes, to thank him. And I thank you for being with me today. For all of you who have been live with me, this has gone longer than the other presentations, but it needed to do justice to sharing Gary's stories. To all of you who are watching the replay, thank you. Please share this with people, because we need to pass his stories forward. And I appreciate all of you for investing your time and your love and your dedication to Young Living. Thank you.